Hello again. Hope everyone's doing well. You should have gotten through the first two stages of the QI roadmap, talking about define and measure. Now we're ready to talk about analyze, analyzing data. So DMAIC, define, measure, analyze, is the next step in our process, and this is a really important step. We're constantly analyzing data. And what we need to do in that phase for measure, hopefully we figured out what measure or measures will tell us, show us what kind of data we can find so that we can analyze that data to study the data and that measures the process to find out what's really going on. So the data are the actual numbers of some sort, some kind of actual quantifiable data that you gather, and that helps you sort of define the outcome measures that you defined. The data helps you be able to demonstrate how bad the problem is at this point. That's really a key question. If there's a problem, how bad is the problem? And you only know how bad it is if you have some data to look at. So I really want to make a strong point that this is an important part of any quality improvement project, to have data to analyze, to be able to demonstrate that there actually is a problem, because what happens sometimes is somebody has an idea about, I think this is a problem and we ought to try to improve it, and maybe even go to the literature and search the literature and find out what some other organizations are doing, and then try to implement an improvement process, only to find out that perhaps there wasn't a problem. If they don't have any data, if you don't have data to show that there's really some sort of problem, and that data is typically quantifiable data. It may be in percentages. We'll talk about that. What kind of data and how do you gather the data? What does it look like? What kind of numbers are there? But the bottom line is, we've had students, we've had people in organizations go through a quality improvement process only to find out they didn't actually have a problem. You can't really show an improvement normally if you didn't have a problem to begin with. So I hope that makes sense, and that's why this step is so important, to be able to analyze data. You want to find out what's going on with those outcome measures that you identified. So we analyze data all the time, even if you don't think you're analyzing, but we're analyzing when you did the literature search and you're reading what some of these other articles, manuscripts say, other studies. You're looking at the data, you're analyzing their data, their conclusions, their results. What did they show in those manuscripts, those studies that they were working on? So we analyze the problem, and the data can come from many sources. And depending on the problem you're working on, data can come from quality improvement, place people that have data that they collect on a regular basis, from infection control, from safety people, from patient satisfaction surveys, maybe even nurse or employee satisfaction surveys. All of that type of data is out there somewhere. It's all being gathered. The hospital healthcare organizations gather data all the time. So the important thing is sometimes to find out, where can I get this data? Who has it? How can I get access to it so that I can actually see if we can look at gathering some data, just to be able to demonstrate that we really do have a problem. So you're going to be doing a project proposal, and you don't have to collect all the data pre and post. I'm going to explain to you the process, and this is what you want to be able to say in a project proposal. When you're proposing a project, and in any organization, and I've done this myself many times when I was a nurse manager and a director of critical care units, when you go to propose a quality improvement project, if you need other people, and that's why we have you building teams, you typically can't just do something on your own. You need other people involved, other team members. You need to get the data from somewhere. So you do a project proposal, write it up, and then you present that to get approval often. And so in that proposal, part of it is to be able to say, here's the kind of data we're going to gather. And what's really good and important often is to be able to collect even a small sample, a little bit of pre-data, what we call pre-implementation data, data that shows you how the current process is working. that can show you if there's a problem. So, for example, if you're looking at catheter-associated urinary tract infection rates, which is something I worked on for many years, it's very easy to get those infection rates from the infection control department, from those people. And so then you can see we're not meeting benchmark. There's typically some benchmark. There's something, whether it's within the organization or it's looking at a national benchmark, and it says our infection rate is higher than what we want it to be, what the benchmark is. And so that's an indication that we need to develop a quality improvement project to try to reduce those infection rates. So you want to figure out what kind of data are you going to gather that will show, be connected to your outcome measures. And then it'd be great if you can collect some brief data to find some way to quantify that this project that you're developing as a proposal, that there really is a problem, because that will give so much more weight to your proposal if you can say, and here's how bad the problem is, with some way of showing some data that shows where you are right now and here's how bad the problem is. That can carry a lot of weight in helping you get a project proposal approved. And while for this course that's all you have to do is to get a project proposal done, we really hope that this is something that you and or others in your area can actually get approved and begin to implement. So that's why we would think this is so important. So for the analyze phase in Moodle, you'll see there's a part 1 and a part 2. In part 1, we want you to do really what we consider the root cause analysis. So in a root cause analysis, you're not yet really looking at the data. What you're trying to do is to figure out what's the root cause of the problem that I've identified. And so one of the best tools to use for that is something very simple that you'll find in the Practicum toolkit called the 5 Whys. And so I described that a little bit for you in another video, but the idea is to ask why 5 times, and each time you go a little bit deeper into why is this happening? Why didn't this happen? Why did that happen? And keep asking those questions. So doing that with your team, again, this is a good team project, something to brainstorm a little bit and get everybody's input in asking 5 whys. Typically at that 5th layer, you're really going to get down to what is the root cause of the problem. And it's really good, if possible, and I'll say that because it doesn't always work out exactly this way, but it's really good if you get to that 5th cause, that root cause, what we really think the root cause is. That's where you want to try to gather data. That's the data that you want to gather, is gathering data on the root cause of the problem. So I hope that makes sense, and every project's a little bit different, so that I say that with just a little bit of a touch of a grain of salt, because not every project may come out exactly to say here's the root cause and here's the measures we're going to be able to use to show how bad that root cause, what the problem is right now, how bad it is, and then be able to measure that later to show an improvement. So, but the 5 whys are very simple. It's a very simple tool to use, but it can be a really highly effective tool to use. Also, fishbone diagram can be used to get to root cause analysis. Typically, you do the fishbone. You could have done it as sort of looking at part of your process map in conjunction with that, or you can certainly do it to try to delve into the root cause analysis. On that, when you're looking at a fishbone on the right side, if you're using a fishbone for root cause analysis, on the right side is here's the problem, here's the effect, and then on those bones, you under people or equipment or materials, you are brainstorming with your team what are all the potential problems that are causes of that effect, that problem that's over here on the right side. So fishbone diagram or 5 whys, that's something we want you to submit under analyze part 1. Okay, so then in part 2, which will be I think the following week, it's really forming a basic data analysis plan. Anytime you're proposing something, you want to have a plan, and a data analysis plan is merely saying here's the kind of data we're going to gather, and we're going to gather it before we do anything. Before we make any improvement, we want to see what the baseline data is. That's called pre-implementation, pre-intervention data, baseline data, if you will. And then, the key is you're going to propose to gather that same data after you have tried a new intervention, after you've implemented something as an improvement intervention. So what's really important is that you're always measuring the same thing before and after. That's really the hallmark of quality improvement projects is the data that you gather, the data that you're measuring, the measurements you're coming up with is the same before and the same after. Okay, so that's really important. So that's the only way to know if you've improved something is to measure the same things and be able to show some difference. So let's talk about then, once you've got this plan together, you also want to be able to describe out of this data that's gathered, how are you going to analyze it, and what are you going to be able to show for that data. So statistics are something that we use obviously very frequently in research projects and evidence-based practice projects. And in quality improvement projects, you're going to use some type of statistics, some type of data, numbers, but for the purposes of this project for this summer, for your proposal, we want you to keep it simple. So you're probably not going to have to worry too much about doing t-tests or regression analysis or some of the really sort of intense research type analytics, statistical analysis that we do. Some of you may be familiar with those if you've worked on research projects, and if it comes around in your project and your data analysis plan that you think it's important to have some statistics, that's fine. But for the majority of you, we really just want you to keep it simple. So keeping data simple typically means we are looking at percentages, maybe looking at range, low to high, or mean or median. Those are sort of what we call descriptive statistics that are fairly simple to calculate. So mean, median, mean is average. It's the same term as average. So if you have 20 data points, 20 numbers, you add all those up and divide by 20, and that gives you the average or the mean for those data points. Okay. Whereas the median, and by the way, so mean or average is typically used when you have, and you can tell this pretty easily when you see your numbers, if you have what's called a normal distribution. Most of you know what we mean when you say you have a bell-shaped curve, normal distribution of numbers, so that you have a low and a high, and the majority of the numbers then tend to be sort of more in the middle, and that's why it's called a bell-shaped curve, because you don't have a lot of the data at the very high end or at the very low end, but it's fairly normally shaped. Sometimes you have data that is not normally distributed, and it could be very heavily weighted on the high end or the low end, and so that's when sometimes maybe using the median is a good descriptive statistic to use. And the median is gathered by, it's not, you don't total up the numbers and divide by that total number to get like you do for average. What you do is you look at, so let's say you have 20 numbers, and you're not adding those numbers up, but you're just trying to find the middle of that range of numbers. If you have an odd set of numbers, if you have 19 numbers, you're going to have one number that is in the very middle of the range between low and high, and that is your median. If you have 20 numbers, if you have an even amount of numbers, obviously you're probably not going to be able to have in your numbers one that's in the middle because you have an even amount of numbers. You may have two. You should have two numbers that come up to the fact that these are sort of right in the middle of this range, and then you want to find the middle of those two numbers. So let's say that in your range of 20 numbers, 12 and 13 are in the middle of your 20 numbers. Well, what's in between 12 and 13? 12 and a half. 12 and a half would be your median, but you're not getting that number by adding them all together and dividing. You're just finding the middle number. So don't want to go into too much detail. Descriptive statistics are pretty easy to use. Each of us as your faculty members can help you with those, so don't get too hung up on that. Statistical significance is something you hear a lot of. You may even read in the manuscripts and articles that you researched in your literature review. For the most part, for QI projects, we're not as concerned about statistical significance as we are about clinical significance. Clinical significance is often not necessarily quantified, but we can say if we reduce catheter-associated urinary tract infections even by 1, that's clinically significant. We may not be able to show a statistically significant number if that was all we did, but we could still say anytime we can reduce infections, we believe that's clinically significant and important to do. So that's just a little bit of talk about the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. So the last thing to say about analyzing and in your project proposal is to sort of be able to describe how will you display or report the data. Once you sort of have this plan of what kind of data are you going to gather, are you going to use percentages, range, median, mean, and then you want to say, and here's how we'll display that. It may be a simple bar graph. Most everybody knows what a bar graph looks like. Maybe a pie chart. There are things called scatter plots and Pareto diagrams that get more complicated, and we can help you. Any of the faculty can help you with those other charts, but it's usually not necessary in these fairly simple quality improvement projects. But if you have a QI person, and many of you do on your team, which is great, you have some experts, you may have nurse educators, managers, physicians, practitioners that can help you with this kind of data analysis and a plan for that, then let them guide you too on what kind of display you'll use for your data. Okay, so basically, in summary, that's all we want to talk about in terms of this analyze portion. Two things. One, in part one, where you're trying to get to root cause analysis, the root cause of the problem that you've identified that you're going to try to fix. And because often with a problem that you've identified, there may be a number of causes, and you can't always attack or address all of those causes, so you're trying to find the root cause, the one we think is the biggest cause, or at least the one we think you think you can do something about. So hopefully that makes sense. So in essence, that's sort of where we're at right now. Once we get the analysis phase done, we'll begin to talk about the I, or improve. But it's really important in this analysis plan and the root cause that you try to convene your teams, even if that has to just be through emails, but hopefully you can have another team meeting, but you can get some people's ideas or thoughts to go along with your own about what kind of data are you going to gather, where are you going to get it, how are you going to display it. So hope that helps, and don't hesitate to ask any of us, your faculty members in your groups, for help along the way. We're all trying to stay in touch with you, and that's not to bug you too much. It's just that we want to stay on top of things and make sure that you're doing okay. We don't want anybody to be falling behind and not know what they're supposed to be doing. All right, thanks very much. Talk to you again.